This week, the audiobook is the short story The Stars by Gary Hill. It's written by Gary Hill and it's read by Gary Hill. Copyright is 2011 and all rights are reserved.
The Stars. The war had been a long and devastating one. It began far from Earth on a Tuesday in November of 2125. By the time it was over, nearly three-quarters of the Earth's population had been killed, but we had won. Still, the enemy in their dying moments had hit us with a killing blow as well. It was one that we still do not know if we will be able to overcome. The colony had been in existence for a little over 6 months on November 13th. Terraforming had only just begun, so spacesuits were still in use everywhere outside of the building complex. The 140-plus colonists, mostly scientists, engineers, and their families, were definitely not prepared for battle, and it didn't last long. When the first ship came into orbit, they had no idea that it was an attack fleet. By the time half of the 40 ships were there, it was nearly over. Their first volley had taken out the power, so even if they had left them, the colony wouldn't have survived. They came into the atmosphere, though, and destroyed every building and every person within a matter of a couple of hours. Their technology was far advanced beyond ours, and the only communication the colonists had managed to get off were some hasty descriptions of the attacks and tactical readings and visuals of the ships. It was a slaughter. When the signals reached Earth through the comm vortex warp, we mourned but figured that it was all over. No one had any idea that it had just been the first strike in an all-out war. This had been our first contact with extraterrestrials, and it had been disastrous. By the time they hit the Integra station, the launch point from which the colony had been established, tactical and operational data had been analyzed, and we had a few ideas on how to mount a defense. We had seen them coming from far enough away that we were prepared. This battle went on for nearly a week, but in the end, our station and all hands were gone. The aliens didn't even take prisoners. We realized this time out, though, that a quick burst of energy that had been measured on the colony was actually some sort of scanning process. We realized that the aliens had gathered all the data from the library computers with that one blast. It didn't take long for all of Earth to start to build defenses against this enemy. It seemed likely that if they had followed the data trail from the colony to the station, that they might come further up the chain, and we had to be ready. The first test of our new resources came a month after the fall of the station. Scout ships spotted the fleet headed towards Gamma Colony. They quickly relayed the information and formed a defensive line. These brave troops knew that they would not survive the battle, but instead would stand and die to try to give the colony a bit of time and prepare. It was a bloody battle, and the human troops did destroy quite a few of the alien ships. But in the end, the two best things that came from the devastating defeat were time and information. They held the ships away from the colony for nearly a month. This allowed for a new defensive force to be drawn to Gamma Colony. Perhaps even more importantly, though, we had begun to get some more concrete details about tactics and abilities of the alien marauders. One interesting fact began to emerge. Apparently, these were drone ships. One team of Marines boarded one of the vessels and found nothing but living tissue within, no controlling life forms. These were some sort of biologically based ships that must have been commanded by some force outside of the vessels. The Marines had collected samples from the bioship, and those samples made their way back to research labs on Earth before the invaders reached the Gamma Colony. When they arrived at the colony, we knew a little more about how to combat these alien ships. This time the battle lasted for 3 full months. During that time, both sides inflicted major casualties on the other, but in the end, it was they who survived. Their path would take them to our solar system next. We knew going into this battle that if they followed the same basic linear path they had thus far, that Gamma Colony was the last defensive station before they would come for the Mars Colony. Efforts had been split between defending Gamma Colony and building a line of defense in our own system. We had one other thing in our favor now. The path between Gamma Colony and Mars Colony would take the invaders nearly 6 months. We had time to examine our data and get more forces up and running. We made good use of this time. In fact, by the time they got to that next target, we had figured out a lot. The ships were actually living entities. We had not only managed to realize that, but work had begun on a virus that would attack them. It seemed like we were on the verge of our first real weapon to use against these beings. It was actually more than that, though. As the battle around Mars developed, Earth commanders had begun to realize there was a sort of link between all of the alien vessels. They found that when they were able to set up a jamming signal, the ship that had been separated from the rest simply stopped in its path. In the first few weeks of the battle, this one lasted almost a year. It was thought that this signal was some sort of control beacon. We would eventually realize it was much more. In fact, the next major discovery didn't happen for several months, but it was the one that gave us the weapon we could use to destroy the aliens. Two discoveries happened at nearly the same time. First came the realization that this link between the ships was sort of a neural connection. And in fact, each of these vessels were part of an enormous life form that stretched throughout the galaxy. There was no race of invaders, but one hive consciousness-based entity. The second discovery was the virus that would attack these separate units of the whole. The thing is, once we knew about the connectivity between them, we were pretty well certain that infecting one of the units would take down the whole colony. We were right. They had destroyed the Mars colony by this point and were ready to begin their assault on Earth, but we managed to infect just one ship, and the whole fleet drew to a stop. It was obvious they were still alive, but it was also obvious they were dying. The entire colony was dying out throughout the galaxy. We didn't know, though, that their final gasp would serve as a big a death sentence on us as we had on them. The ship sat dormant for a time, then a sudden burst of activity caught us unprepared. They set a course for the sun. When they reached it, they detonated as some type of weapon we had never seen before. The explosion turned our sun into a dying sphere. Our scientists examined the detonations taking place and figured out we only had a couple of years left before the star would turn critical and begin the last phases of its destruction. Plans began to come together. No one could figure out how to revitalize our sun. There was talk of some massive space ark, but no one knew if there would be time. Then came Dr. Tolliver. He had a revolutionary plan. He came up with a way of folding space. We would move stars around using this method to pull a healthy star. In fact, the aliens' home star, we had gotten a lot of data from their beings' ships as they were in their death throes to replace ours. It required transpositioning a number of stars in sequence to produce the desired effect. The angular geometric process was so far beyond what our science had come up with to this point that it seemed almost like magic. The thing is, as all the quantum physicists looked at the plan, it seemed like it would work. Since we didn't have time to evacuate the planet, this would have to be our one attempt. So it was decided to move forward. I came into the project fairly early. It was decided that Dr. Tolliver would need an assistant to coordinate all the people working underneath him. Since I was a bright up and coming quantum physicist who had extensive experience in managing manufacturing operations, they felt I was just the guy to fill the job. My task was to work closely with Tolliver and see to it that his ideas and visions were put together into a plan that would work. The entire planet's resources were available to us on this project. I hadn't been working on the project long before I began to wonder about this star realignment process. Tolliver could never be pinned down to tell anyone how he came up with the concept. He told me that it had come to him in a dream. At first, I thought that this was just a way of avoiding answering the question. Later, I came to suspect that there was something more to it. The thing is, the whole process was so far beyond the scope of anyone else's scientific endeavors that it seemed almost impossible that someone could have made this level of a jump in technological concepts. The process seemed more like magic than science, in much the same way a light-emitting diode would have seemed like magic to a caveman. Well, I'd seen the computations and calculations that made the process possible. They were also quite alien. There was a certain almost intuitive feeling of dread that came upon me whenever I looked at those equations. They revealed a series of angular revisions and reevaluations that had both a familiar and frightening air to them. Either Tolliver was the most intelligent human ever to exist, or he was mad, or perhaps a bit of both. In any event, my work was to assist him, and even that was not the simplest thing to do. He was very guarded about the processes involved. There were few times when he would share information with me. Instead, he seemed to want me just as a person, me as just a person he could send on mindless tasks. Many times I felt it beneath my skills and education. This was probably part of why I started digging on my own. This would be the beginning of the end for me. While I had seen, as had the rest of the world, Tolliver's more finalized plans and computations, at least in the proof versions, no one had seen the notes and concepts that had brought him to this discovery. I decided that it was high time I had a look at them. Something seemed sinister and strange about this whole mess, and I wanted to know what it was. By observing Tolliver for a while, I discovered the place where he kept his secret journals hidden. I know he didn't notice me lurking in the background when he stashed them away from prying eyes. I made my way there, a hidden corner of his office, in the night and retrieved them. Then I copied them and put them back. Tolliver was none the wiser. I wish I could say the same for myself. The journals were almost psychotic in their seemingly random notations of strange mathematical equations, words in some alien languages, and drawings of stars and metaphysical symbols. This was definitely not science, but I wasn't sure what it was. That took me on a major quest of research. This journey led me to ancient books and occult references. As it turned out, I had stumbled onto some bizarre mystery that had been locked away for time immemorial. It went against everything my scientific mind had been trained to believe, but the proof was right in front of me, leaving me with only one conclusion. That's why I acted. It was the day when the switch was to be set. Tolliver was standing proudly in front of his device, waiting to activate it. The media were all gathered around, as were world leaders. I had smuggled a pulse pistol into the chamber, and as he was ready to switch it on, I pulled it and fired. My intent was to hit the machine, but I was knocked to the ground by a security agent, and the blast hit Tolliver instead. He was falling. The only thing was, as he fell, he hit the controls and the switch was set anyway. There was a swirl of action. I managed to evade the agent who threw me to the ground. Others were running toward me, but I got to my feet and still held the pistol. As I was dodging, I could hear the machine whirling into life. I shot directly at it. The hit was good and the device was destroyed, but I wasn't sure whether it had been stopped before coming fully online or not. I still don't know for sure. I do know that as I was forced to the ground again, I realized that Tolliver was dead. The machine was irreparable, assuming anyone understood it enough to fix it, and all the notes were gone. I destroyed them earlier that day. This device would not be built again. I sit in my lonely cell to this day. When they questioned me about my motives, I told them about everything I had discovered, how there had been beings on the earth long before us, horrible beings, how they were not dead but rather slumbering. I told them about the greatest of these beasts, the dread Cthulhu, and how he spoke to people in dreams, those same dreams that Tolliver cited as his inspiration for his work. I explained how these old ones were waiting for the stars to be right so that they could return and wipe out all of that had come before them, or come after them. I also showed them how Tolliver's alignment of stars was exactly the one shown in the ancient drawings. I explained the whole thing to them. They obviously didn't believe me. They branded me mad. Unfortunately, the realignment process wasn't going to be fast. It would take several months to come into place. I have no window to the night sky. They won't let me have access to any news. I have no idea if I stopped it or not. I do, however, know my fate. One alternative is that they are working to evacuate as much of the planet as possible before our sun burns out. If that's the case, they will leave me here to freeze to death in this cell. If not, then I was unsuccessful in stopping the machine, and the stars will realign. If that's what happens, the beast from prehistory will return. I am hoping for and welcoming the cold dark of freezing earth and dreading the possibility of the alternative. So when I wrote this, obviously I was trying to do a Lovecraftian thing, but hide the fact that it was a Lovecraftian thing. And I hope I did that toward the end, even though there are clues throughout earlier. So I hope you guys found it creepy enough and spooky enough for Halloween. If you heard snoring over by me, that's just my dog Wally, who's sitting here snoring the whole time.
Spooky Ventures is the home for spooky content and spooky merchandise on the web. Check it out today at spookyventures.com. And remember, always keep it spooky.